Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining today. As usual, make sure you fill in your attendance in the attendance form, which will be in the comment section. And if you have any questions, just put them in the comments, and inshallah, we'll ask them at the end of the session. And thank you, Dr. Khalid, for holding these lectures. And we're ready to start when you are, inshallah.
Okay, thank you very much, Noura. If you just give me 1 second to share the screen. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. We are in our 9th session and got one more lecture to go after this, and then hopefully maybe even next week maybe we can hold the in 2 weeks time we can hold the session on Zoom, so everyone can ask the questions in the wrapping up discussion, but hopefully we'll keep everyone posted with that, inshallah. Where we got to was the British occupation, so we'll do a quick recap of what we've covered, and then we will discuss the British occupation and the current occupation of Bayt al-Maqdis. And thanks to everyone for joining us, and those who will watch this later on, inshallah. We talked about this idea of nation states and this idea of new identities that were created and given to people to fight over, unfortunately, and how this has happened. And we said that the Crusader mentality since the time of Salah ad-Din hasn't stopped, and we gave different examples from the time of different times. We said in the 13th century there was, or in the 12th century, more than 30 Crusader campaigns to regain this land. And we said even with Christopher Columbus going west, the aim, in his own words, was to gather the gold and to take this land from the Muslims. So in a sense, what was this Crusader mentality never died out, and we discussed the different things that have taken us up to the 18th and the 19th and 20th century. Starting with the 19th century, we talked about particularly Muhammad Ali Pasha, who took this region and then gave a lot of Western influence and penetration into the Holy Land. And we talked about Palmerston, who was then a minister and then later the Prime Minister of the UK. And during that period, they established the first British consulate, the first foreign consulate inside Bayt al-Maqdis. And only during the time of Muhammad Ali Pasha, who rebelled against the Ottomans, were they able to start this. And this was the first point. And also the British during that time tried to push and lobby the Ottomans to allow, or to even issue a firman, a proclamation to allow the Jews to settle in Palestine, which was not accepted. And we went through some of these after the establishment of the consulate, how this then became the role of this British consulate is the protection of the Jews and allowing them to come to Palestine. The idea, this Western project, even before Jewish Zionism, this Western project was pushed. We said initially Napoleon, actually in 1799, he was the first one to suggest the establishment of Jews in this area, and then how the British took this idea forward. And we see this from as early as 1838. Shaftesbury, one of the lords in the UK, together with Christian Zionists, pushing this idea. And these were his words: is the establishment of an anglicized Jewish colony in Palestine, strongly sympathetic with British interests and dependent on British aid. So the British will be the ones that will be protecting this. This is nearly 80 years before the British even got there. And this was pushed by Christian Zionists in the UK, and the British government saw this as an idea to push their influence in that region. So this idea of a Jewish client state in Palestine became, we see this in British newspapers, in publications that were in Britain. Clayton put it was the idea of this Jewish buffer state was to ensure British presence in a strategically vital area. And this would be for British interest. Beside the religious factor, this would be for a British interest. And also it was pushed that it would be for the interest of the British in India. A Jewish client state in Palestine was increasingly seen as a vital British colonial interest, particularly in India, particularly in the trade routes and connecting India to Britain, particularly after we see this after the British occupied Egypt and then started pushing this idea forward. But we see this in other writings, such as Thomas Clarke, who in 1861 said India and Palestine, or the restoration of the Jews, viewed in relation to the nearest route to India. So there was a lot in British colonial interest in this particular idea. In the 19th century, there was a lot of European based religious activity in the Holy Land were increasing, and various circles in Europe tried to create a Jerusalem question, and the internationalization of Jerusalem project started to emerge. And this was being pushed forward, particularly in different periods during the 19th century. There was different schemes for who would control this area and how this idea would be pushed forward. Another initiative in 1841 by the British consul in Damascus, Charles Henry Churchill, he wrote to Moses Hayim, the leader of the Jewish community in England, and he was pushing for this idea that the Jews need to be on board, and we are pushing this idea on your behalf, and you need to be on board. There was not a lot of Jewish interest, by the way, in this idea, but we saw this in the British government. Palmerston wrote a letter to the ambassador in Istanbul to lobby the Ottoman government to allow the Jews to come to Palestine, and the idea of creating a buffer state under British control within Ottoman lands. These schemes and these projects, although they didn't succeed until they got Jewish Zionism on board on this project, and we see this with Theodor Herzl, who established the first Jewish Zionist movement and tried to push this idea forward, and that is only when it started to become the meeting of Jewish and Christian Zionist ideas and colonialist ideas coming all together in this idea and pushing this idea forward. So we know of the what was suggested to Sultan Abdul Hamid through Herzl and in return for consolidating all the Ottoman debt. So the Ottoman Empire at that time and the Ottoman Khilafah was in a lot of debt. So paying all this in gold, and besides paying Sultan Abdul Hamid an enormous amount of gold in exchange for a charter allowing Zionists access to Palestine, which Sultan Abdul Hamid rejected. As we move forward, we see, particularly with at the beginning of the 20th century, three conflicting promises made by the British. The first is promising Sharif Hussein of Mecca in return for his support to the British, promising him Palestine as part of the Arab lands. They were not very clear on the issue of Palestine, but they were much clearer on others. We'll come back to them in a few minutes. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, where the British and the French decided to share this land and split it into two. There was the Russians in it, and the Russians, due to conflicts inside Russia, they pulled out of it, and also other parties. But the Sykes-Picot Agreement just became down just the British and the French, and then we have the Balfour Declaration promising Palestine to the Jews. This is a map showing that Palestine will be part of the Arab land that is promised to Sharif Hussein, and this was included in the McMahon Pledge to the Arabs, or to Sharif Hussein. And we see this letter of their commitment to King Hussein, and we talked about it in some detail. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was to bring this area in yellow that you see in front of you. That will be an international zone under international administration, and A, B will be the rest of Syria. Iraq will be split between the British and the French in this regard. We talked about the idea of the flag and the idea of the boundaries of Palestine, but this is a very important figure, Mark Sykes, and this is in England, depicting him on his grave. But what is very interesting is this crusader mentality. He's dressed in crusader gear, even with the sword, the way he's clothed. And what is interesting is what you see underneath his feet. Underneath his feet, he's got the Muslims being squashed, and you can see it in this image, and the text underneath it shows this. So you have Mark Sykes, and you can see underneath, dressed in this crusader gear, and underneath his feet he's got the Eastern Muslims, as you can see, depicted at his grave. So this idea of the crusader mentality never died out. What is interesting in this regard, that the Balfour Declaration was a promise made to the Jews. However, the Jews were not happy with this, and the only Jewish cabinet member, Edwin Montgay, he believed that the Balfour Declaration was anti-Semitic, and I shared with you last week in the last lesson, the text published by the Palestine Return Center on the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, with all the texts within it. So the Jews were not happy with this, but this was being presented to Zionist Jews who were pushing this idea forward. Another important point that I didn't mention was there was different drafts of the Balfour Declaration, and actually the only Jew in the cabinet, he was not happy with this. So the draft had to be redone to include the local population, and to try to say that they will not the local Arabs and the local Palestinians' rights and their civil and religious rights of the non-Jewish communities in Palestine will be preserved. But in going through this process of the drafting and redrafting of this, before it was announced and before we came to the last draft and the last what was issued to Lord to the Zionists in the UK. Before this, actually approval from different countries were achieved. So the French actually issued something similar 6 months before to the Jews. The Americans were on board. The Italians, even letters of sympathy, even from the Pope, were gained before the issuing of the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration was issued just 1 month before the occupation of Palestine, and the division of this area was to split the area, as we saw in the Balfour Declaration, with British and French and other international powers. In 1917, in December 1917, the British came in, and actually Churchill wanted it to be a gift to the British public, a Christmas gift to the British public. So the British Army set forth with its different components. It included a lot of Egyptian and Indian Muslims who were under the British control, so they were part of the British Army, besides the Sharif Hussein flank that came down from the south and joined and occupied Aqaba from the Ottomans. By December 1917, the Ottomans were forced, although initially they had victories against the British. However, the Ottoman army had to withdraw on the beginning of December, and allowing the British to take over the city by the 10th of December 1917, with General Allenby taking the city, and the Ottomans withdrawing. And we talked about how the Crusades, this idea of the Crusade, continued in the Western mind, and we see it in the image that you see here on the right, how it was depicted that they were shaking hands, congratulating them on achieving what the Europeans were not able to achieve earlier. Actually, before the British occupied that area, under 400 years of Ottoman rule, the Christians and Jews were left to administer their own internal affairs under Islamic law. Even conflict amongst Christian communities on controlling holy places started the Crimean Wars in the mid-19th century, 1856. The Russians, the French, and other powers, some siding with the Ottomans, some siding against the Ottomans. Istanbul was under siege at that time, and the Sultan generally favored the Greek Orthodox because they were the locals in that area. And we said that the British were tried to establish a Protestant community there and built the first church there during the time of Muhammad Ali Pasha. However, the Ottomans dealt with the different groups in and allowed religious freedom, even with all the differences. Eventually, the status quo kept the keys of the church in Muslim hands because of the conflict, the inter-Christian conflict. They were not happy with that, with the one group or one sect holding the keys. So this is what eventually started the Crimean Wars, and eventually we came down to some sort of agreement allowing all Christian groups to have some say. Even today in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it's divided from that time into different sections and into different. Each sect has a place within the church, and even if you look at pictures of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, you see that there is a ladder placed on one of the balconies to say that this is for that Christian group. But under the Ottomans, Christians and Jews lived and peacefully, and were allowed to had religious freedoms. And sometimes a threat from a Jewish woman to go to the Muslim judge, the Qadi, was sufficient to make the Jewish judges adopt a more flexible position on financial and personal matters, because the Jews had their own courts and the Christians had their own courts. So, but there is the High Court, which is the Muslim Qadi. So sometimes the Jewish rabbi would not, or the Jewish judge would not give the Jewish woman their rights. So they would threaten him to take him to the Muslim court. On that, he would give them their rights. The turning point for Bayt al-Maqdis and for Palestine was there was different turning points, but the turning point was the British occupation of Egypt, and that's when things started in 1882. Waves of Jews coming to Palestine started to influence, and this is where Sultan Abdul Hamid stood against this and issued red passports to allow the Jews only to visit the Holy City and the Holy Land only for a short period, and they would have to leave. But there was other turning points, particularly the end of the Ottoman rule, the British Mandate, the Jordanian, then the Zionist rule. The British, when they occupied Palestine, established a new military administration under the name of the Western Administration of the Occupied Enemy's Land. In the 1st of July 1920, a civil administration replaced the military administration, and the first civil administration was led by Herbert Samuel. He was the first High Commissioner. He was a Jew, so he was appointed by the British government to administer Palestine, and he was also a pro-Zionist. So during his period, actually a lot of changes took place. He gave 300,000 square, how do you put this, 300,000 dunum. So 300, nearly, each dunum is 100 square meters. So he gave 1,000 square meters, my apologies. So 300,000 dunum were given to the Jews, to the Zionists, in the most fertile part of Palestine, close to the coastal area, and another 200,000 were given with a very small rent payment that they were required to pay to the British government. So nearly 500,000 dunum were given to the Jews immediately after the British occupation. The transformation started to take place with Herbert Samuel's laws as the first High Commissioner over Mandate Palestine, which the mandate was accepted by the League of Nations at that time. Chaim Weizmann, now the Zionist leader after Herzl, He visited Jerusalem after the British occupation. His speech, he gave a speech, and Samuel organized a meeting between him and the son of Sharif Hussein Faisal, in which they created a friendship and allowing the Jews to migrate and accepting this migration. And even they met in London, and we showed the letter between them and how things started to take place. But Wiseman actually went through numerous routes with Herbert Samuel, and allowing an architect of Alexandria to come to Jerusalem to work on the structural plan of the city and to divide the Jerusalem, the city, into 4 divisions. So designing and redividing the city, the walled city, the area around the walled city where no building was allowed, the eastern Jerusalem, allowing building with restrictions, and Western Jerusalem is a developed area allowing building. And this was the boundaries of Al-Quds started to change at that time, extending it into the Western Jerusalem, which was created by the British at that time. The mandate system, as we mentioned, was established by Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, formulated at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and allowed the territories inhabited by peoples unable to stand themselves would be entrusted to advanced nations. So the idea here is that the British will run this country until the local population can handle their own affair and push this idea forward. But this was namely for the Jews and not for the Arabs in that area. The British occupation was, as we said, the turning point, and it was the worst type of occupation in the modern era. It was oppressive to the local population. The High Commissioner supported the Jews politically through including them in the political and administrative power. Number of Jewish employees went up in the administrative positions, including Hebrew as one of the recognized languages, including establishing many Zionist institutions, such as the Jewish Agency, which was very fundamental in the later occupation of Palestine by the Zionists themselves. Also supporting them militarily by overseeing the establishment of Jewish military units such as the Haganah, which was also had a massive role to the occupation and the Nakba in 1948, and it was the nucleus of what then became the Israeli Defense Forces, or the Israeli Occupation Forces is a better terminology. The Jews in Palestine increased in numbers during the British occupation from 8% in 1919. Actually, before that, the numbers were much lower, particularly at the end of the Ottoman period. The numbers wasn't even 1%, but then the numbers grew, particularly at the end of the Ottoman period. As we said, after the British occupation of Egypt, the numbers started to go up, and then by 1917, the British occupation, they allowed a lot to come in, and then by the 1919, there were 8.3% of the overall population, and in 1948, there were a third of the population, close to a third of the population. The Palestinians, Christians and Muslims started to the uprisings against the British, Initially, as we mentioned, there was the British were seen as the liberators of the Turkish, between quotation marks, the Turkish occupation. That's how they were being marketed. And by the third or the second year of the British occupation, uprisings and revolts against the British started to take place. The first was the Nabi Musa uprising in 1920, and this was the first bloody clashes between the Muslims on the one side and the Jews and the British police on the other side. And this lasted for a few days, resulted in the killing of many Muslims, and many were injured, and also Jews and were killed and injured during these uprisings, starting from Nabi Musa, and then later on in Hebron. And then the biggest revolt took place in 1929, when Jews started to take over Al-Buraq wall, the western wall of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, saying that the wall is ours. And the next day was the anniversary of the birth of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And after the Friday prayers, Muslims went in great numbers to demonstrate towards the Buraq wall, and this is how it started. And the British sided by the side of the Jews, unfortunately, and this there was an investigation done by the British, and a committee was selected of non-British individuals, particularly Europeans, and they came after. This was started in 1929, and the report was finalized, and it came to the conclusion that Al-Buraq wall is solely a Muslim property, the pathway in front of it. Not only that, let me actually read directly from the actual report. Just 1 second. Yes, I've got the report here, the Western Wall, a report of the International Commission appointed by the British government in 1930 and approved by the Council of the League of Nations in 1931. So let me read from the conclusion. The conclusion arrived by the Commission on the basis of the reasoning and evidence that they mention in about 80 or 90 pages, can be summed up as follows. To the Muslims belong the sole ownership of and the sole property right of the Western Wall, seeing that it forms an integral part of Al-Haram al-Sharif area, Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, i.e. Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, which is a waqf property. Quoting again, to the Muslims there also belongs the ownership of the pavement in front of the wall and the adjacent so-called Maghariba Moroccan quarter opposite the wall, in as much as the last mentioned property was made waqf under Muslim Sharia law, it being dedicated to charitable purposes. So the actual report is very clear on this, that and this was approved by the League of Nations. And if you like, I can share with you the full report, in which they interviewed Jews and Muslims and came to this conclusion, and it was approved by the United at that time. Today it's in the United Nations, but at that time it was the League of Nations in 1931. The Commission had the former Swedish Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Vice President of the Court of Justice at Geneva, and the former governor of the east coast of Sumatra. These were the committee that came up with this report. So this report, according to international law, this Al-Buraq wall, and they also included the maps and the of the wall and the details of it. And the report, according to international law, the wall is a Muslim waqf and only belongs to the Muslims. The area in front of it, the pathway, is also belonging to the Muslims. The quarter, also the Moroccan quarter or the Magharibi quarter, is also belonging to the Muslims. So the whole area is a Muslim waqf property, and it should only be in this regard for Muslims. We will see in 1967 what the Zionists did by taking the area and with no regards to international law, how this was done. You can find this on the Islamic Jerusalem electronic library, and I can share the link with you if you are interested. Another very important revolt took place by Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam. Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam was actually in the new divisions. He was not a Palestinian. He was now a Syrian. He was living under the French mandate. And Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam fought against the French. And then, because of the importance of Al-Aqsa and the importance of Palestine, decided to come to Palestine. And he was based in Haifa, and he fought against the British. He was an imam, and he was a leader in the community. He was well respected amongst the Palestinians. They did not see him as someone of a different nationality, because he was Palestine was an extension of historical Syria and Bilad al-Sham. And this is very, very important, that seeing these divisions, still at that time, someone like Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam did not see Palestine as a different country. He saw it as part of a place that he needs to defend and fight for. Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam had a very different approach to things. He saw that negotiation with the British and contact with the British was a waste of time. They are here to establish a Zionist state, and the only way forward was to fight this occupation. Other Palestinian leadership saw that the only way to gain right was through negotiation with the British. And I will mention an interesting story between Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam and Hajj Amin al-Husseini. Hajj Amin al-Husseini became the Mufti of Jerusalem after his brother, Sheikh Kamil al-Husseini. And when he became the Mufti, actually, we mentioned that the British were happy with him at the beginning, but then when he turned against the British, things got out of hand. But initially, the British saw him as one of their, they saw him as, he's a friend of the Brits, because he managed to recruit many in the army of Sharif Hussein, about 4,000 people, and this brought him a lot of favor because they were on the side of the British. But later on, this changed. However, there was an earthquake that took place in Al-Aqsa Mosque and in Jerusalem and in Palestine, which destroyed parts of Al-Aqsa Mosque. And Hajj Amin al-Husseini tried to raise money for this. And Allenby suggested to him that we can put an advert in the Times newspaper in London, and we can raise the money within a week. Hajj Amin al-Husseini, he said, no, this money should come from the Muslims and we do not need your money. So he wrote to different Muslim rulers and in India and in different parts of the world. And eventually the money came, much of the money came through Faisal and Abdullah, the sons of Sharif Hussein, whom their the money that they have actually comes through the British. So Sheikh Azzuddin al-Qassam, on this regard, he said there is no, instead of repairing Al-Aqsa Mosque and repairing the mosques, we should be spending this money on fighting the British. What use will this money be of for us if we lose Al-Aqsa Mosque and if we lose Palestine? So this is what we need to do. And he continued to fight against the British until he was surrounded in after leaving Haifa to the suburbs of Jenin and fighting the British soldiers. And eventually he was martyred. He became he was killed by the British in 1936, and his death started the Palestinian 1936 revolt, a 6-month strike led by Farhan, one of the Mujahideen that was with Sheikh Azzuddin al-Qassam, and they continued to fight. However, other Palestinians continued the negotiation with the British, particularly through a lot of the Saudis at that time, the Arab leaders in Jordan and in Iraq and other areas said that they would make sure the British gave them their word, and through their intervention, the strike of 1936 unfortunately came to a stop, and this resulted in the British going forward, or the British gave some concessions on the numbers of Jews that they would allow to enter, but eventually the numbers went back up again. During this 30-year period of the British occupation, all the foundation of the Zionist state was in place. They were trained in the police, they were trained in the army, they had everything. And by 1947, there was a proposition to the partition plan given to the British that we should divide Palestine between the Jews and the Arabs. The Jewish population at that time was only a third, and they only owned about 5% of the land. Even after 30 years of the British occupation, the Jews only owned less than 6% of the land of Palestine. But the UN partition plan suggested giving the Jews 55% of Palestine, and only 45% will be given to the Palestinians. The map hasn't come up, but we'll look at it within another map within a few minutes. But how did it happen? How did the Zionists manage to control 80%, 78% of Palestine between 1947 and 1949? What happened is that you can see the map here on the left. 530 villages and cities were military assaulted by the Zionist guerrillas. Military assaults taking place by Jewish forces, by the Zionist forces, the Haganah and the Irgun and the others. 122 localities were expelled by these forces. So what they created is, for example, they would military assault something as a place like Deir Yassin and kill all the women and the children, and everyone in the city. The massacre that took place in Deir Yassin was one of the worst, but even Israeli archival sources have just recently been leaked, showing that Deir Yassin was one of many tens of massacres conducted by these forces. And if you read the works of Elaine Pepe at the University of Exeter, he talks about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and how this actually took place. Many cities, 49 localities fell. You can see on the maps the different colors of how this took place. Psychological warfare and fear of attack. So what they did is they will say that we're going to attack this place, and the people would have to flee because some people would continue to fight, and the women and the children and the elderly would flee to other areas. A few localities in the northern part of Palestine, the Arab army said that they were coming in, so they asked them to withdraw, but this was less than 1%. The majority were through military assault, so you can see the map here again. The majority of Palestine was taken through military action. Other parts were done by expelling the population, psychological warfare, and only very few. We have some localities we don't have, or villages we don't have much information on, but you can read more on this by the work of Salman Abu Sitta, who published a massive book on how these localities and Benny Morris's work also on this issue. So what we have is the Palestinian exodus. 83% of the population was directly caused by military action by the Zionist guerrillas, and many of them showing that actually part of the argument that the Zionist propaganda machine tries to push, that actually the Arabs or the Arab leaders told them to leave, and this only happened in less than 1%. So Benny Morris shows that this was actually a myth, and that it was not a reality as the Zionists tried to show. So what we see here from how the land was started to disappear, with the exception of the West Bank and Gaza, and actually the Arab armies were under the command of Glob Pasha. Glob Pasha, he was leading the Arab armies, and he was a British general. So the Jordanian army was led by this general, and all the Arab armies were under his command. So you can see here the conflict of interest in this issue. Not only that, on the ground, the commanders were also British. So they were the ones saying that we will apply the partition plan, which will give you 45%. But what actually took place on the ground is what was left was only 20% by the end of that war. We have the propaganda that was being pushed forward that this land was without people. And this idea started with Reverend Alexander Keith, who pushed this idea forward that the land of Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land. And this became the slogan of the Zionist movement, the Jewish Zionist movement, by the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. Lord Shaftesbury in England also pushed this idea: a country without a nation is in need of a nation without a country, pushing this idea that the Jews are the rightful owners of this land. And in 1901, this was published: Palestine is a country without a people for a people without a country. So we can see how this idea was being pushed forward. We see this Haim Weizmann, yes, with a Z. I had misspelled it earlier. Thank you, Hassan Haider, for mentioning this. This was how it was pushed by the Jewish Zionists. There is a country which happens to be called Palestine, a country without a people. Our intention is to finally establish such a society in Palestine that Palestine shall be as Jewish as England is English or America is American. So this is what was being pushed forward. And you have how will you deal with the inhabitants there? The chairman of the Jewish National Fund was saying, if there are other inhabitants there, they must be transferred to some other place. We must take over this land. We must have a greater and nobler ideal than preserving several hundred thousands of Arab fallahin, Arab farmers. It's not. This is, you can see Haim Weizmann's statement in 1914 before the British occupation, and this is in 1930 under the British occupation. What was Palestine like before the Nakba? It was already a very well-developed society under the Ottomans. There was 29 towns or cities. There was cities like Al-Quds or Quds Sharif under the Ottomans, Nazareth, Nablus, Hebron, Ramla, Lud, Gaza. Most of them were very well-developed cities. The city of Haifa was very, very well developed. Haifa had a population of 70,000 Palestinians, 30,000 Jews. This is just before the Nakba, before 1948. 19 schools, students, mosques, churches, hospitals, daily newspapers, 7 daily newspapers. You're talking about a very well developed society. 2/3 of the Arab population was also rural, living in villages. The main source of income for them was agriculture. Palestine was exporting oranges, exporting other goods to across the world, particularly to Europe. Before the British occupation, actually Jews lived side by side with the Muslims and Christians. But only when this became their project that to get rid of the population there, things started to change, particularly with Zionism. Then things started to become tense and violent between the local communities. You can see the old houses, the cities, everything was quite developed in a sense. The Haganah they had different plans. In 1948, Plan D was to create territorial continuity for the Jewish side. So they were not happy with the partition plan because at some areas they would be disconnected. The plan was to control as much land as possible, to have the smallest Arab population, and this was pushed forward with the war that took place. This is a text directly from Plan D by the Zionists. In the conquest of villages in your area, you will determine whether to cleanse or to destroy them in consultation with your Arab affair advisor, and you are permitted to restrict insofar as you are able cleansing, conquest, and destruction operation of enemy villages in your area. This was the direct command for how this would take place. We talked about this. We gave the details of how the hundreds of cities and villages. 200 localities, 51% were through military, taken through military assault. The second thing that they wanted to achieve was the prevention of return. So this is Golda Meir in 1948, on the 6th of May. She says, should the Jews make an effort to bring the Arabs back to Haifa or not? Meanwhile, so long as it is not decided differently, we have decided on a number of rules. And these include, we won't go to Acre or Nazareth to bring back the Arabs, but at the same time, our behavior should be such that if, because of it, they come back, then let them come back. We shouldn't behave badly with the Arabs who remain, so that others who fled won't return. So during the war, the question whether Palestinians should be allowed to return was an open one. However, this turned after the war by the destruction of the villages as much as possible during the military operation. So you're destroying the houses. The Palestinians left with their keys, going back hoping to go back to their houses. But now the houses, many of the houses were destroyed. Prevention of any cultivation of land by the Arabs, settlement of Jews in a number of villages and towns so that no vacuum is created, and the propaganda that was being pushed forward. This is from Ben Gurion's from June 1948. However, as the war, as we mentioned initially, the question was, should they be allowed to come back under our sovereignty or not, was open. However, as the war progressed, the Israeli side came to adopt a strict policy of preventing any return back of Palestinians. The images are not coming up for some reason, but different methods to prevent the return, destroying the villages, settling Jews in the cities. So a city like Haifa, and I would recommend reading Ghassan Kanafani's novel, or actually it was made into a film, Return ila Haifa, Returning to Haifa. The film you can find online, and maybe it can be shared. It shows how the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from Haifa, and then in their houses, in their places, everything was replaced with Jewish Zionist migrants who were now to take over, even taking one Polish family who did not have children, took a Palestinian child. And the whole story is based on that, on this story. So watching this film, I think, would give you a better idea of how this took place. In most cases, Jewish forces bombed the villages, sometimes from the air, so the population would flee. They would attack from three sides, so people would run to other areas, and then they would take that. This is from a British intelligence officer saying, during the morning, the Jews were continually shooting down all Arabs who moved both in the Wadi and the Old City. They included complete, indiscriminate and revolting machine gun fire, mortar fire, and sniping on women and children sheltering in churches and attempting to get out through the gates into the docks. Talking about the sent the Arabs through the batches, but were considered, you can see the actual text, how some managed to get out, but the majority were gunned down by the Zionist guerrillas. We saw how the British started this from the early 1920s, and now we are coming to how this is now coming to an end. We talked about the revolts, We talked about how Palestinians started the revolts from as early as 1920, and then the story of the renovation of Al-Aqsa Mosque, and then the Burak uprising in 1929, and coming to the report by the League of Nations that Al-Burak wall is solely Muslim, the assassination and the killing of many Palestinians and the execution of many Palestinians by the British, and three important figures that became part of the Palestinian resistance were held in the Akka prison, and their last words saying that our lives are for Palestine. We call upon all Palestinians not to forget our blood and our souls that shall fly over the land of this beloved Palestine, this holy land. And we give our lives without hesitation. And our call to, and our wish from all leaders, kings, princes of the Arabs and the Muslims around the world, do not trust the British and their policy, and they are very cunning, and they need to save Palestine from this occupation. And these three Palestinian revolutionary leaders, Ata Zir, Fuad Hijazi, and Ata Zir, Fuad Hijazi, and Jamjoom, all of them were executed by the British. This started the Palestinian exodus, and you can see how they were pushed out of their land, crossing into neighboring countries, crossing into the West Bank, into Gaza, into Jordan, into Syria, into Lebanon, into Egypt, and the international community just gave them tents to put over their heads. And the Nakba, and what happened in the Nakba in 1948 was not the first Nakba. We said the first Nakba was in 1917, and before that we have the intellectual Nakba, but this was the exodus of 700,000 Palestinians from their lands. And you can see here in the images how Palestinians are carrying their elderly over their shoulders to cross over. You can see taking whatever they can get their hands on, and some even with nothing, leaving their homes to live in refugee camps. And these are from the United Nations set up the UNRWA, which was to give some support to these refugees, to give them food and something over their head. But in 1949, there was, like we see today, Syrian refugees under snow, suffering and freezing to death. And many of the Palestinian children and elderly died in the 1949 in these camps. My personal family story: my grandfather lost 3 of his children during this exodus. My uncle and 2 of my aunts died during this exodus, and they didn't move far away from their village. They wanted to go back, and my grandfather lived all his life in a refugee camp with the radio next to him, waiting for the day he had the title deeds and the key to his house, wishing to go back home. And we see today with the war in Ukraine, international hypocrisy on this issue, and many people have showed this, and you maybe watched some of the politicians saying it's been 70 years in Palestine and more, and nothing has been done. And you saw the racism even in some of the reporting by Western media. The people of the Ukraine are white with blonde hair and blue eyes, and it can happen to Iraq and to Syria and maybe even to Palestinians, but this is something that they didn't expect to happen to white people. This racist institutional racism has been exposed in this, and this international hypocrisy over this issue, how it has taken place. We come to 78% of Palestine is now under Zionist rule, and the Zionists took this area, and this area is now being turned into what they called Israel. I'd like to share a map so you can see clearer where we are at the moment. The maps that I had for some reason haven't come up, but I'd like to just 1 second, if I can share a map here so you can see this a little better. Yes, hopefully this map would come up. This was the partition plan. The partition plan suggested that the green area would be Palestine and the yellow area would be Israel. However, what happened in 1948 was something different. So what we see in the next map, if it would come up, yes, in this map, you see the middle map is the UN partition plan, but what actually the second map on the right, if we can zoom in, maybe that would be better. This map here, only about 20% was left to the Arabs, Christian, and Muslims, and the rest of it was taken by the Zionist occupiers. So the Zionist occupiers managed to take all of this, and in 1967 they didn't stop there. In 1967, this goes further with taking the rest of it, not just the rest of Palestine as drawn by the British, but it even goes beyond that. It takes parts of Syria and parts of at that time the West Bank was part of Jordan, Gaza was part of Egypt. So all of this was now being taken by the Zionists in the 1967 war. And in 1967, all of Palestine, Mandate Palestine, is now under the British occupation. The British, sorry, all of Mandate Palestine was now under the Zionist occupation. So all of it is now under the Israeli state, and it included Eastern Jerusalem. What you see in the image here in front of you is the Maghariba Quarter. The Maghariba Quarter was created as a waqf property by Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, actually his son Al-Afdal, and it was housing the Moroccans, the Tunisians, the Algerians, all those from North Africa who came and settled in this area. And we have many waqfiyas. So according also to that report, all of this quarter, and you can see it also in this image here, the quarter with its madrasas, with its the schools, the houses, all of it is Muslim property. You can see it is the same image here. And the first thing that the Zionists did was to take over this area. So in the 7th of June 1967, Al-Aqsa was occupied, eastern Jerusalem was occupied. The Israeli flag was raised over Al-Aqsa Mosque on top of the Dome of the Rock. The Zionist forces celebrated their victory inside Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the military chaplain, soon to be the chief rabbi of the State of Israel, suggested that Al-Aqsa's Dome of the Rock should be destroyed with 100 kilograms of explosives. However, this did not materialize for some reasons that we can explain if there needs to be. But Al-Aqsa was now under occupation. They rolled inside Al-Aqsa Mosque with their armored vehicles. As I said, they celebrated the occupation of Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Holy City, and managed to defeat and kill all those who were defending the city. Here you see in this picture, what was his name? The one-eyed, I forgot his name. Moshe Dayan. Moshe Dayan. He came into the city and announced military rule. You can see him here coming through the northern gate of the city, and they took Al-Buraq wall, and you can see in these images taking pictures inside the Masjid al-Aqsa, and you can see how very indecent these pictures are and the humiliation that this brings to the Muslims. Moshe Dayan announced that the Waqf will administer the mosque themselves, and Jews will be allowed to visit but not pray inside the Masjid al-Aqsa, and had what they called the Protection of Holy Places Law in 1967. So the text says, in this regard, in accordance with the Washington Declaration, Israel respects the present special role of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan in the Muslim holy shrines in Jerusalem. When negotiation on the permanent status will take place, Israel will give high priority to the Jordanian historic role in these shrines. This is part of the Jordan-Israel peace agreement, so this text is there. But according to Moshe Dayan and this law in 1967, Al-Aqsa will stay in the hands of the Muslims, and the Jordanian Waqf will continue to administer the inside of Al-Aqsa Mosque. And according to Jewish law, this was placed on the gate of Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, the western gate of the Magharibi gate, because the key is now in the hands of the Zionists. The announcement until today, actually, according to the Torah, it says, it is forbidden for any person to enter the area of the Temple Mount due to its sacredness, and Jews are not allowed to enter the area of Al-Masjid al-Aqsa. Next week, we can talk, in the next class, we can talk more about how this started to change. And now Jews are pushing for not just entry into inside the Masjid al-Aqsa, but prayer inside the Masjid al-Aqsa has started to take place. The second thing that was done after the occupation of Al-Buraq wall, the Magharibi gate, the destruction of the whole of the Magharibi quarter. Everything was completely destroyed, with the houses, with everything in it, the schools, the madrasas, everything was destroyed following the confiscation of Al-Buraq wall, which again, according to international law, is solely a Muslim property. And Jewish prayer in this area, it's important to mention, that only started at the end of the Ottoman period. Jews did not come to pray at this area, or they did not see this area as sacred to them until much later in history, particularly during the end of the Ottoman period, during the time of Muhammad Ali Pasha, who built a synagogue for the Jews in the Holy City, and he allowed them to pray in this area. So this is in the 19th century. that they started to pray at this area, not before that. So the schools, the mosques, the hundreds of houses were destroyed, and many of the residents who came from North Africa for centuries, they've been staying there. Their livelihoods, their houses, everything has been completely destroyed. You can see the image on the right. The houses and the buildings are intact, and now here everything has been destroyed, extending this to allow Jewish prayer in this area. So all of this was completely destroyed. From that day on, every single day to this very day, soldiers enter Masjid al-Aqsa on a daily basis. Forget the incursion by incursions by Jews and tourists inside the Masjid al-Aqsa. Soldiers and police, armed soldiers and police, enter al-Masjid al-Aqsa on a daily basis, sometimes even firing at the Muslims while they are inside al-Masjid al-Aqsa. Actually, most of the Muslims in the holy city, in the Holy Land, cannot reach al-Masjid al-Aqsa. So people in Gaza have never seen, 2 million people in Gaza have never seen al-Masjid al-Aqsa in their life. They only live about 80 kilometers away. And now with this wall, the separation wall that they built, people who can actually see al-Aqsa with their eyes cannot reach al-Masjid al-Aqsa and pray in it. And this, before the Zionist occupation, Muslims used to visit Mecca, Medina, and Bayt al-Maqdis at the same time. So they used to, part of the pilgrimage was the visiting of al-Masjid al-Aqsa, and what they call taqdis al-Hajj. To sanctify your Hajj, you had to visit the 3 places. For Hajj only you need to visit Mecca, but people who visit Mecca would also visit Medina and also go to al-Masjid al-Aqsa. In 1969, so this was in 1967, the occupation, taking of the wall. In 1969, al-Masjid al-Aqsa was set on fire, and it was set on fire by a Christian Zionist, because there was a Christian church in the United States that prophesied the rebuilding of the Jewish temple over the site of Al-Aqsa within 4 years. A priest, his name was Armstrong, in the United States after the occupation in 1967, he said within 4 years the temple shall be built. And Christian Zionists are famous for the idea of forcing the hand of God. So in the pursuit of this, Al-Aqsa was set on fire. Actually, an attempt was to do this in 1969, which failed. In 1968, which failed. In 1969, the same person, Michael Rohan, who was a Christian Zionist from Australia, came, and with the help of the Jewish Zionists, he managed to set fire to Al-Jami' al-Aqsa, the southern building inside al-Masjid al-Aqsa. He set fire to it, destroying the minbar that was brought by Salah ad-Din after the liberation of Bayt al-Maqdis from the Crusades. That was built by Nur ad-Din Zinki, and causing destruction to a third of the building. And you can see in the images, actually the Israeli government, the Israeli municipality stopped water reaching the mosque to put out the fire. The fire brigades came from Hebron, from Al-Khalid, far away, quicker than the ones in the actual city. So there was a lot of hands here at play to try to stop the putting out the fire. The fire destroyed, you can see the minbar of Salah ad-Din completely destroyed in this picture. It was nothing is left from the minbar except for these pieces, which are now inside Al-Aqsa Museum. The dome was badly damaged, and it took years for the renovation. Immediately after the occupation, the third thing that started was tunnels, digging tunnels underneath Al-Aqsa Mosque. And these tunnels, not for archaeological purposes, they said they were there in search for Jewish remains and a Jewish temple, but we know that this is a fallacy, because from that time until today, none of this actually has been achieved. And Sheikh Ra'ad Salah was one of the first people to expose and to go underneath the tunnels to show that these have also destructive purposes, to weaken the foundations of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, that any small earthquake will destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque. There was many attacks in the 80s and other years, killing Muslims inside Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, and one of them was the Al-Aqsa massacre, as temple groups wanted to put the foundation stone for the temple. So two routes for temple groups to access Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the legalization in the Knesset and the Israeli courts, allowing Jews entry and putting the foundation stone. And this caused the Al-Aqsa massacre and the killing of tens of Palestinians inside Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. So many hundreds and thousands were injured, but many were massacred. And you can see here the blood of the Muslims inside Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. This was only one episode. In the year 2000, particularly Ariel Sharon entering Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa with thousands of soldiers, and this caused the second Intifada, Al-Aqsa Intifada, also the killing of hundreds of Palestinians inside Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. Temporary division of the mosque. Today, as we said, Muslims have difficulty accessing their mosque and harassed at the gates. All the gates of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa are manned by Israeli soldiers, and they decide if they will allow you to enter or not. They expel many of the Palestinians, issue court orders banning them from entering their mosques, like Hanadi Halawani, Khadija Khwais. Sheikh Ra'ad Salah was banned from entering the mosque for 15 years by a court order. Now Zionist extremists are allowed access into the mosque on a daily basis with protection by the occupation forces. This is part of a plan to divide the mosque in terms of time, temporal basis. In the morning and afternoon, Jewish and tourists and can enter inside Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, while you can see in this image soldiers attack elderly Palestinian women at the gates of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. In this picture, I don't show you the next one, but Muslim woman's hijab is being pulled off at the gates of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, while Zionist Israeli Jewish extremists are allowed inside Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, and this is progressing on a daily basis. As I mentioned, there is not a single day that goes past without Israeli soldiers and police entering inside Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. And in the past, Muslim women and men would go and make takbir, so they do not feel comfortable. This is the only thing that they can do to try to stop them from entering the mosque or restricting them. Most of these people have been banned from Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, and they cannot enter Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. And you can see here Hanad Al-Halawani saying, "It is my right to pray inside Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa," which many of them are not allowed to pray, so they had to pray outside, while you see Jewish extremists are celebrating while they are entering inside the Masjid al-Aqsa. This causes, you can see, this is inside the Masjid al-Aqsa, heavily armed soldiers firing stun grenades, gas bombs, bullets at Muslims inside al-Masjid al-Aqsa. And there are many stories that I've witnessed myself inside al-Masjid al-Aqsa that it is very painful to retell these stories. But maybe at another occasion I can retell some of these stories. You can see here the thousands of soldiers surrounding the Muslims inside the buildings of Al-Aqsa mosques, while others are not allowed to enter. This was a few years ago. You can see how many soldiers just trying to take one single woman down. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 soldiers just trying to take one single Muslim woman and arrest her just outside al-Masjid al-Aqsa. Christian holy sites have also suffered under the occupation, not just the mosques, also Christians. The Holy Sepulchre was closed for many days due to Zionist and Israeli occupation actions. Many of the churches are vandalized by Jewish extremists, and the suffering of Palestinian Christians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, who live under the same occupation as Palestinian Muslims since 1967, continues, unfortunately. This is a picture of the Pope at the separation wall just outside Bethlehem. And you can see that this separation wall, this apartheid wall, divides. You can see divides the people in the Holy Land in favor of the Zionists. Here, the burning of a church, and unfortunately, many of the Palestinian Christians have migrated to the West. So they used to make a large proportion of the Palestinian society. Now they only make a few percent, as many of them have migrated to the West and Australia and other areas, and they've been welcomed into these areas. Another example that I would like to mention is Al-Masjid Al-Ibrahimi in Hebron. The reason why I would like to mention this is because the Zionists would like to apply the same format that they have achieved inside the Ibrahimi Mosque in Al-Khalid, the Mosque of Ibrahim alayhi salam. They would like to apply the same format of dividing Al-Aqsa Mosque into two. So we talked about the division by time, but this is a spatial division. So dividing Al-Aqsa Mosque into two, one part will be for the Jews and one part for the Muslims. They achieved this in the Mosque of Abraham in Al-Khalil in Hebron after 1994 massacre. In the 1994 massacre, a Jewish doctor and rabbi entered Al-Masjid al-Aqsa during the month of Ramadan and killed tens of Palestinians while they were praying the morning prayer, while they were fasting. And you can see in this image the blood of the Muslims after they were massacred. And the mosque after this massacre was closed for 6 months. And when it was reopened, 60% of the mosque was given to the Jews and only 40% was left to the Muslims. And the same is they would like to apply in Al-Masjid al-Aqsa. Spatial division in Al-Aqsa Mosque, there have been many plans presented. And this is, you've seen this in this is the whole area of Al-Aqsa Mosque. And these are being proposed and suggested and even discussed in the Israeli parliament, in the Knesset, that parts of Al-Aqsa Mosque need to be given to the Jews. And they suggested that we should give the eastern part of Al-Masjid al-Aqsa because this is not used by the Muslims, particularly the area of the Rahmah, the Gate of Rahmah. And this is why Palestinians and Jerusalemites have stood their ground in defending the area of Al-Aqsa Mosque, not to allow this to take place. Actually, there was many suggestions to give first the Marwanid Musalla, which is the biggest covered area inside the Masjid Al-Aqsa, and to open gates from outside and make this into a synagogue. They've already taken Al-Buraq wall, they've dug the tunnel underneath Al-Aqsa Mosque, and they have places of prayer for Jews underneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the western area, small hotels. They already took Al-Buraq wall, as I have mentioned. The second was to give the area underneath the Masjid Al-Aqsa in the eastern part of Al-Aqsa Mosque, and Sheikh Ra'ad Salah and the Muslim Islamic movement inside 1948 land managed to reopen this and to allow Muslim access to it. The recent suggestion is to give the eastern area of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. And when Zionists and Jewish fanatics enter Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, they enter through this route. You can see the cursor. They enter from this area and they come to the eastern part. And recently they have started conducting prayer. Before this, it was silent prayer according to different court orders. But now they started loud prayers inside the Masjid Al-Aqsa and making even sujood inside the Masjid Al-Aqsa. Even the dead are not safe inside Bayt al-Maqdis. There has been many the graves vandalized at the Rahma cemetery, at the Ma'manullah cemetery, vandalized by Jewish extremists and fanatics. But even the Jewish government, the Israeli government, has taken over large parts of Ma'manullah and Mamillah cemetery and turned it into parks. And not only that, they are building what they call the Museum of Tolerance over the graves of Muslims in that area. We will finish here and take your questions. So please, if you have any questions, please write them. And I would like to conclude with the intellectual Nakba again. And we will continue in the next session talking about the current situation in Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa and the deal of the century and where things seem to be heading, and the future of Bayt al-Maqdis, the future of Palestine, will be discussed in our final session next week. In 2 weeks' time, in our next session. But please, if you have any questions, please, we've discussed nearly 100 years from the British occupation in 1917 until, let's say, around 2017, about 100 years have gone past. But what we have is the rewriting of history. Throughout this 100 years, history has been manipulated and presenting the creation of Israel as a war of independence, allowing the Jews to create a state. And unfortunately, the narrative, the Zionist narrative, is the prevailing narrative across the world, from the east to the west. Their academic works and their writings seems to be the narrative. When they are talking about the first temple and the second temple, these are something that historically and archaeologically have been debunked, and they do not exist. Even the universities in the UK, there was a survey in UK universities that in history departments, the idea of the temple, and archaeology departments, the idea of the temple is not taught because it's not factual. It's not something that actually took place, and it's not a reality. However, what we have is this narrative, and through rewriting history on the ground by renaming the streets, Judaizing the city, taking over houses, putting Jewish symbols, and trying to push a narrative. For example, from 1967 until recently, all archaeological digs around the Masjid al-Aqsa have found 0 Jewish remains. And this was announced by the lead Israeli archaeologist. And by the way, all Israeli archaeologists are linked with the Israeli army. So most of them are actually generals. And after secular generals, and after the diggings that they have done since 1967, all they have found was Islamic, Umayyad, and Byzantine remains. They have not found a single Jewish remains of a first temple, or even the existence of that hasn't been proved by even Jewish Zionists. And this is being pushed on a religious front. And in the last 20 years, most of the fundings for the excavations and the digs around the Al-Aqsa Mosque and underneath it and south of it is being sponsored by Christian Zionists in the United States. And this is now being reflected in the city of Silwan, has been turned into the city of David, and renaming everything to have a Jewish name or to give it a Jewish identity. The street names, the street signs, everything has been redone. The name of the city, everything in that city has been, there has been attempts to Judaize and to change the identity, the Muslim identity of this city into a Jewish one. However, this is only part of a bigger picture when we're talking about the rewriting of history. And here we are talking about Jewish Zionists and Arab Zionists. And you might be surprised, or Muslim Zionists. You might say it's impossible. How can you have a Muslim and a Zionist? Unfortunately, today, where the Jewish Zionists have failed, they are using Arab and Muslim Zionists to promote this narrative. In the picture on the top, you have someone called Professor Mordechai Kedar. Mordechai Kedar, he's been pushing the idea that to Muslims, Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock has no importance whatsoever. And it was only built based on political reasons. It has no religious significance. And Al-Aqsa Mosque is not in Palestine. Al-Aqsa Mosque is somewhere close to Mecca. And he tries to twist Islamic narrative. And anyone who knows a bit of Arabic knows that this guy has no ground to stand on. However, they have used someone like the guy at the bottom, Yusuf Zidan. Yusuf Zidan, he's a very famous Egyptian author and literist, and he has been prompted by Sisi to undermine the importance of Al-Masjid al-Aqsa in Palestine to Muslims. And what Yusuf Zidan has done, and this has been leaked by a journalist, that he was prompted to do this by Sisi after the coup, after he got rid of Morsi, he tried to push this, after the coup, push this idea. So what Yusuf Zidan is repeating are exactly the same words of Mordechai Kedar, word for word. He doesn't even, he doesn't have the skills to even go back to the text that Mordechai Kedar quotes, but he actually just mentions it and claims that Al-Aqsa is not in Bayt al-Maqdis. Al-Aqsa is not in Palestine. Al-Aqsa is close to Mecca, and there's no consensus on this, and he tries to push this idea forward. After the normalization with the Zionist state started by Arab countries, similar names in Saudi Arabia, in the newspaper of Awqaf, so exactly quoting the words of Mordechai Kedar, but not mentioning the name of Mordechai Kedar, but directly mentioning that it is the author's opinion that Al-Aqsa has nothing to do with Palestine or Bayt al-Maqdis. On Kuwaiti TV, a guy suggested that this land is for the Jews, as Allah says in the Quran, that this is a Jewish land. You have a French imam also promoting this idea. You have many authors in the West pushing these ideas that Al-Aqsa and Bayt al-Maqdis is not important to Islam, using Muslim names to promote this idea, because when it was being pushed forward by Zionist, Jewish, and Western authors like Daniel Pipes and this Mordechai Kedar, people were not giving it much attention. So using people like Yusuf Zidan and others seems to be much more effective in trying to undermine the importance in Islam. Actually, when Yehud Olmert was the mayor of Jerusalem, he translated much of these literature, not just Mordechai Kedar's, but many of the Jewish Zionist authors who tried to undermine the importance to Islam. He translated their books, their articles into Arabic, and distributed them free of charge on the people in Jerusalem to say, Al-Aqsa actually is not here. Al-Aqsa is somewhere else. You don't need to fight for this area implicitly. This has really no significance in Islam. And trying to say that it is impossible that the Prophet came on the night journey to here. It's so far away. It's impossible at that time to travel such a distance. And some even suggesting it was just a dream that the Prophet saw, and it was not related to this area. And Al-Aqsa could be in the heaven, or it could be next to Mecca, or it could be somewhere else. So this push, latest push in the last decade by non-Jewish Zionists to try to promote this idea has been pushed forward. This apartheid state is pushing this idea in numerous forms and numerous fronts, and the idea that both Christian Zionists and Jewish Zionists are pushing for is the destruction of Al-Masjid al-Aqsa and the rebuilding of a Jewish temple over its site. We can talk more on this in our next discussion in the next class, where we can engage with this idea of the future of Al-Aqsa Mosque and where it is going. We've been talking in the last 9 lessons on the importance of Al-Aqsa Mosque, the history of Bayt al-Maqdis from the beginning of time. We started with Prophet Adam into the Natufians, the Canaanites. We came through history all to today. We've covered tens of thousands of years of history. But what we see is that actually history flows in this city. It's flowed for the last 1,400 years, and before that and after this. But there are points of interruption. These interruptions in history we've seen during the Crusader period, and we see today in the Zionist occupation. And this, based on reading history, this Zionist occupation will not survive long on this land. We're not talking about just 100 years. We're talking about thousands and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years of history of this place. And its general context is that it's been peaceful and everyone living side by side. The interruption at the moment, the Zionist interruption to this history and the Crusader interruption, have only limited span in time. in the Islamic framework, this is al-Ard al-Muqaddasa. Al-Muqaddas, the Holy Land, means mutahhara, that no injustice will survive in this land. And you might say, but the Zionists have been in this land for more than 70 years. When you put it within the wider context, 70 years or 100 years is not a long period in history. And this Zionist occupation will come to an end, and this Zionist occupation will not survive much longer. It is a Western project in this region. And as the Ukrainian war has started, it shows that the West, which is failing Ukraine and does not want to be involved militarily. And many Israeli and Zionist authors are afraid of the same thing. I was just reading some articles written by Jewish Israeli authors recently, that if something happens to Israel, would the West leave Israel today in the same way? There are many question marks on the future of this occupation, but we will discuss some of them in the next class. And it raises a lot of questions on what is the future of this Zionist state. What is the future of Bayt al-Maqdis? What is the future from an Islamic perspective? What is the future from Christian Zionist perspective? What is the future from a Jewish perspective? There are many questions on the future of this land, and there are many prophecies in Jewish and Christian, as well as Muslim texts. We will go through some of them according to international relations, according to political science. Future studies are discussing the future of this, and we can come to some of the discussions by some of the Israeli authors who are talking about the demise of this Zionist state from political science. That what brought the Jews together in 1948, this idea of nation state, is dying out. And there are so many divisions with Israeli society that without an external threat, that this would not survive. And we will come to Netanyahu's promise that he made to rabbis who have a prophecy that this state will not survive more than 76 years, promising them that he will try to extend the life of the state to 100 years. So, and not Ariel Sharon, but Peres, who had also a similar suggestion that Israel will not survive another 10 years, never mind 100 years. So with all the input and all the suggestions that from different perspectives, we will discuss this in our final class, inshallah, next week. And hopefully we might have it on Zoom, so we can engage and you can ask questions and we can engage in the final class. Instead of comments and questions, you would write, maybe you can engage in the discussion directly. Back to you. If we have, we can take them, and then we can conclude this class.
Yes. Jazakallah khairan, Dr. Khalid, once again for that enlightening lecture. I hope everyone benefited. We do have one question. It says, what's the reason behind the Arab countries' silence on this issue?
That's one question that needs a lecture to try to unfold. Actually, Arab countries were not silent on this. In 1969, and Muslim countries, in 1969, when Al-Aqsa, an attempt to burn Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa took place by Christian Zionists, and the Zionist state was complicit in it, the OIC was set up. And OIC, the Organization of the Islamic Conference, was set up for Al-Aqsa Mosque. However, this has not achieved much over the last years. And in the last 20 years, the Committee on Al-Aqsa hadn't even met once to this extent until Donald Trump announced his plan, or the deal of the century, and moving the embassy. And we'll discuss this maybe next week. The problem with the Arab states is that they are linked to the Western Bloc, and particularly the United States. And these states, with the exception of what happened in 1969, coming together, standing up together for Al-Aqsa, at least in a show of solidarity, or whatever you would like to call it. Apart from that, and apart from what King Faisal attempted of the oil embargo against the West, apart from these two actions, unfortunately, the Arab states and the Muslim states have been relatively silent on this issue. And to understand why they would be silent on this issue is that their interest is they cannot stand without Western support. These are not real functioning states. And without the support of the United States, countries like Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Jordan, and most of the Arab states, unfortunately, cannot survive. And Donald Trump actually was very frank about this, and he spoke openly on this when he said, and you can rewatch the videos if you like, but he said, I called King Salman and I told him that he has to pay. Without 2 weeks of American support, there will be no Saudi Arabia. And then he took it down to 2 hours, and then he took it down to 2 days, and then down to 2 hours. Many of these states are very fragile. They don't have. They try to buy the support of the people with the oil money they have. However, there are opposition, and most of the opposition in countries like the United Arab Emirates are in prison or are in exile. The current normalization with the Zionist state was pushed forward by Jared Kushner and Donald Trump. And they succeeded in bringing more Arab countries to the table. They succeeded with United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan. All of these, the people in these countries are against the occupation. And they are trying to win the leaders over this. Already Egypt and Jordan have normalizing agreements. Actually, they have a peace treaty with Israel. But now bringing this, and with this Abraham Accords that they try to push forward, it just shows you how fragile these states are. And Donald Trump has shown it. And he's put pressure on this, not just on them, on countries like Indonesia. Indonesia, during the reign of Donald Trump, was under a lot of pressure to normalize, as the biggest Muslim country, to normalize relation with Israel. Pakistan was under pressure to do this. With the current American administration, these pressures on these states haven't stopped. Actually, many people think that Joe Biden is different from Donald Trump, but in reality, over the question of Al-Aqsa Mosque and over with relations with Israel, he is a fierce Zionist, and you can watch his videos online where he talks about himself as a Zionist, and the discussion he had with his father when he was a kid, that does he have to be a Jew to be a Zionist? And his father says, no, you can be a Zionist without being a Jew. So in this regard, these Muslim leaders, there is nothing to expect from them. Recently, we'll give you another example. When Donald Trump announced that, we will discuss it in detail next week, but when he announced that Israel is the eternal capital of the Jewish people and the eternal capital of Israel, at that time, OIC was under the leadership of Turkey. Erdogan called all the Muslim leaders, 56 countries, to come and to make a strong statement. They're not going to go to war, at least make a strong statement against what Donald Trump is doing. Called them to Istanbul. Out of 56 leaders, only 14 leaders turned up. And MBS was calling them by one, telling them not to go. So you can see how the tides are shifting in favor of Israel in this regard. Some leaders sending their secretary or sending a minister or sending a representative, maybe even the chauffeur, to come and to represent them at this summit in Istanbul. And the outcome of the summit said that Eastern Jerusalem, which is only 14% of Jerusalem, will be the future capital of Palestine, of this nation state. You saw where Donald Trump and the Zionists were aiming, and where we were. They set the bar so high, and it was very low by, unfortunately, Muslim leaders whom only a fraction turned up. So people in Palestine have lost hope in OIC, in the Muslim leaders, but they haven't lost hope in the Muslim Ummah, and they are betting on this, not on the leaders, but on the Ummah to do something for this. So on the question of Yasemin, Arab countries are quite quiet about this, not just the Arab countries, unfortunately, the Muslim countries. These leaders each are looking at their own interests, and they are not interested in this. As you said, all Muslims must stand up together. They need to, but this, like we have seen at the time of Salah ad-Din, this is very. It took a very long time to unite the Muslims under one banner, and the first action that the teacher of Salah ad-Din took to push this forward was the idea of education, and pushing this idea forward was important in this regard for the community as a whole. So we need to first work on education. Muslims need to know the importance of Bayt al-Maqdis, that this is not a Palestinian issue. And Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam made this very clear. And we need to work on this. Back to you.
Right, Jazakallah khairan. We have a few more questions coming in, but I don't know if we have time.
Okay, maybe we can take them quickly and then wrap up in the next 5 minutes.
Right, we have one question on the Turkish government. Do you think the Turkish government is the most trusted in their support of Palestine?
In fact, one of his first.
Sorry. Can you repeat the question? Sorry, someone was asking for the video of Biden, where a Jew, would I be a Zionist? I'll share the video so they can have it from Twitter. So I'm sharing it.
Thank you.
They can see this. And also, if you type this on YouTube, you'll get a lot of videos. Can you repeat the question again?
Do you think the Turkish government is the most trusted in their support of Palestine?
Another very tricky question. Actually, Turkey was the first Muslim country to recognize the state of Israel in 1949. So Turkey, old Turkey, was unfortunately with a secular, as a secular state. It aligned itself with the Western Bloc, and it was the first Muslim state to recognize the state of Israel. However, New Turkey has been taking a different stance and has been supporting Palestine in the international arena, and it has been pushing forward many of the Palestinian issues, particularly under the leadership of Erdogan. However, each government looks at its own interest in this regard. And next week, next Wednesday, the Israeli president has been invited by Erdogan to come and visit Turkey. And most of the NGOs in Turkey have made a statement against this, and they are saying that they are not happy with this. And they do not welcome the Israeli president into Turkey, but he's being invited in an official visit to come and visit Turkey, and this will take place next Wednesday, unfortunately. What game is the Turkish government playing on this regard? I'm not sure, but Turkey as a government, or Turkey as the state and a government in the last 20 years, has supported Palestine and probably has been the biggest supporter of Palestine from across the Muslim countries, followed by Malaysia, which was clearly with its Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad being very outspoken on Israel and its atrocities. So these are two good examples. We gave many of the bad examples that we have mentioned, like the ones normalizing with the state of Israel, and their numbers are increasing. The numbers of the ones supporting Palestine is on the decrease. So whenever anyone does say something or supports this at the state level, it needs to be welcomed. Malaysia in this regard has been very strong. On the other front, Turkey has been doing this, but now it seems to be trying, particularly in recent days, trying to re-normalize relations with Israel. The relations with Israel between Turkey and Israel went bad, particularly after the Davos incident, when Shimon Peres was given the platform and Erdogan wasn't. And then he spoke about, he openly said 1 minute, and then he spoke about the atrocities that Israel has done. Then the relations went even worse after the Freedom Flotilla and the biggest participation from the Turkish İHA, taking aid into Gaza, and the killing of the martyrdom of 9, then 10 Turkish activists. The relationship with Israel was well, and then particularly in the last 20 years started to deteriorate. And now what are we moving towards with Turkey and Israel? There are many question marks. So I hope that answers the question, Hanif.
Yes, inshallah it does. Thank you very much, and Jazakallah khairan once again for the lectures, and we look forward to the next session, inshallah.
Inshallah. It will be our final session. So I hope we will be able to organize it with others joining on, maybe have it on Zoom, and then we can have the last lecture and then have questions, open questions and answers people can ask directly on all the 10 lessons that we have had, inshallah.
Inshallah. Inshallah. We can end the meeting today.
Okay, thank you very
Jazakallahu
much.
khairan.
Thank you.